The sound that finally broke me was not the shove itself, but the thin, hollow crack of porcelain as my plate hit the floor. Because it was in that quiet second afterward, while gravy crawled across the hardwood and the Christmas lights blinked politely in the window, like nothing sacred had just been shattered, that I realized my life had been quietly slipping out of my hands for years without my noticing, and that the man I thought I was, the man who believed that loyalty was armor and hard work was protection, had been standing naked in the middle of his own house, thinking he was safe. My name is Alan Walker. I am 56 years old. And until that night, I believed in very simple rules that were passed down to me by a father who died with calloused hands and honest eyes. You show up. You keep your word. You carry your house. And if you do those three things long enough, you earn your place not only in your family, but in yourself. I met my wife Linda 12 years ago when we were both bruised by life in the quiet ways only widows and widowers understand. The kind of bruises you don't show because they are not on your skin. And she came with a son named Kyle, who was 16 at the time, already tall, already angry, already walking around with the kind of silence that makes men nervous. And I promised myself I would never try to replace his father. I would simply be steady. Because steady men build things and angry boys eventually need something solid to lean on, even if they don't know it yet. I fixed the leaky basement, replaced the roof, paid for braces, paid for soccer trips, taught him how to change oil, lent him tools, gave him rides, handed him money I never saw again, and told myself every time that this was what family was supposed to feel like. Even when he never once called me Dad, only Alan, clipped and distant like I was a neighbor instead of the man carrying the mortgage. And when Linda and I moved into her split-level house, I brought one thing that mattered more to me than anything else: my father's old oak chair, refinished by my own hands. And it became the chair at the head of the table not because I demanded it, but because it had always been there. Because it was where the man who carried the house sat. Because that was the way I had been raised and the way I believed the world worked. For years, no one challenged that place. Not until Kyle's biological father, Ray, reappeared after more than a decade of absence with loud laughter, expensive cologne, and the kind of false confidence that tricks wounded boys into thinking a ghost has suddenly become a hero. And suddenly, Kyle started orbiting him like he was gravity, repeating his jokes, copying his swagger, and treating me like a piece of furniture that had always been there and could be ignored. And Linda told me to be patient, told me it was good for Kyle, told me Ray was trying. And I swallowed every doubt because I loved her and because I believed that if you stayed steady long enough, you couldn't be erased. Christmas Eve was supposed to be simple: turkey in the oven, Bing Crosby humming through the kitchen, lights blinking softly, family around the table. And I reached for my father's carving knife the same way I had done for years when Kyle's hand slammed onto the back of my chair and he said, loud and clear, "That seat belongs to my dad. Get out." And I laughed because my brain couldn't accept that sentence yet. And then he shoved me, not playfully, not accidentally, but with both hands like he meant to prove something. And my boot slid on the rug and my hip hit the floor so hard it stole the air from my lungs. And gravy exploded across my shirt and the floor like a stain spreading through my life. And the room froze in a way rooms only freeze when something sacred has just been violated. I waited for Linda to say my name, waited for her to tell him to stop, waited for her to choose me. And instead she grabbed napkins and started wiping. The floor like the spill was the problem, and not the man lying there staring at the underside of his own table. And something inside me went quiet. Not angry, not loud, just cold and final. Because in that moment I understood what I really was to them: not family, not husband, not father, but maintenance. And I stood up slowly, swallowing the pain in my hip and the shame in my chest. And I walked out into the Iowa cold without saying a single word. Not knowing yet that this was only the first crack. That something far worse than humiliation had already begun moving behind my back. Something that would soon reach into my name, my credit, and the very foundation of the life I had spent decades building. And as my truck pulled away from that glowing porch light, I had no idea that by the time the sun rose again, I would be facing a betrayal that would force me to choose between the man I had always been and the family I thought I had. I did not go back to Linda's house that night, not because I wanted to punish anyone, but because the moment. I sat alone in my truck with the heater humming and the snow whispering against the windshield. I realized that if I walked back inside, I would either explode in ways I could never take back or collapse in ways that would make me smaller forever. And I had already been made small enough. I drove instead to my own old ranch house on the edge of town. The one I had kept after the wedding because it was paid off and because some part of me had always wanted a place that was truly mine, a place that did not require permission to breathe. And as I limped inside and lowered myself into the recliner with an ice pack against my hip, I kept seeing Kyle's hands on my chest and Linda's eyes on the floor, and the more I replayed it, the clearer it became that the shove had only been the loud version of something that had been happening quietly for years. My phone buzzed before midnight. Then again and again, Linda's name lighting up my screen like a ghost I wasn't ready to face. Then Kyle, then Linda again, and I let every call die because I already knew what her voice would sound like. Soft and smoothing and full of words that tried to make sharp things feel round. And I was tired of bleeding unrounded edges. Around 2 a.m, I finally drifted into a shallow sleep, only to be yanked awake by a sharp electronic chime I had almost forgotten about. The sound of my credit monitoring app sending an alert. And the second I opened it, my stomach dropped as if I had stepped off a curb that wasn't there. Because the screen showed a sudden drop in my score and a new inquiry that I did not recognize. And in my world, those numbers were not vanity. They were proof of a life lived responsibly, and nothing touched them unless someone had touched my name. By the time the sun crept pale and gray over the frozen street, my phone had turned into a machine that would not stop ringing, Kyle's number flashing over and over. Linda's coming in behind it, and finally a local number I didn't recognize. And I let all of them ring until my voicemail filled with messages that swung wildly from panic to irritation to thinly veiled accusation. Kyle demanding that I fix it. Linda begging me to please answer. And then a calm professional voice identifying herself as Marcy from Hawkeye Community Credit Union, asking me to call her back regarding urgent activity on my account. I drove to the credit union with my jaw clenched so tight my teeth ached. Snow crunching under my tires, my hip flaring with every bump, and when Marcy slid a folder across the desk and turned her screen toward me, I saw my name typed neatly beneath the word guarantor on an $18,000 loan I had never agreed to, and beneath it, a signature that looked like mine from a distance but fell apart under real scrutiny. A shaky, looping version of my name signed as Al in a way I had not used since. I was a boy, and my father was still correcting my handwriting at the kitchen table. I felt the room tilt. Not with anger, but with the sick, cold understanding that someone inside my own family had used my trust as a tool. And when Marcy gently explained that the fastest way to protect myself was to file a fraud report, I did not hesitate, because whatever was left of my marriage, my pride, my place at that table, none of it mattered more than my name. And I signed the statement knowing that I was setting a chain of consequences in motion that could not be undone. The moment I stepped back outside, my phone lit up again, and this time I answered. Linda's voice shaking on the other end, asking where I was and what I had done. And when I asked her why my name was on a loan, there was a pause so loud it felt like an answer. And she finally whispered that Kyle had needed help, that Ray had promised to cover it, that it was temporary, that she had signed for me because I would have said no. And in that one sentence, she admitted everything that had been wrong between us for years. That my no had never been respected and my yes had been taken for granted. And I hung up without yelling because something in me had gone quiet and solid instead of loud. I drove to her house, not to fight, but to see them, and Kyle met me in the living room like a cornered animal. Eyes red and wild, Ray pacing behind him like a storm, looking for something to strike. And when Kyle accused me of betraying them by reporting fraud, I realized that in his mind, my name was just another resource he was entitled to use. And when he said I had always covered it, it hit me harder than the shove had, because it was true, and because it showed me exactly how my kindness had been rebranded as obligation. I walked out before my temper could make a bigger mess than my silence ever could. But that night, my voicemail filled with Kyle's desperate promises and Ray's thinly veiled threats. And I finally understood that the man who had pushed me out of my father's chair was now trying to sit in my life, my credit, my future. And I knew that if I backed down now, I would lose more than a place at a table. I would lose myself. 2 days later, I sat in a beige office at the credit union with an investigator who asked me to sign my name 10 times while he compared it to the forged version. And when he nodded and said the signatures did not match, I felt something close to relief for the first time since Christmas Eve. Not because the situation was improving, but because the truth was finally being written down somewhere official. And as I left that meeting and watched my phone light up again with Kyle's name, I knew with a clarity that scared me how far this was about to go. Because men who are used to being rescued do not take consequences quietly. And whatever came next was not going to stay inside our family anymore. The county letter arrived on a gray Tuesday morning, slipped through my mail slot with the soft scrape of paper against metal. And I knew what it was before I even bent to pick it up, because once you tell the truth to a system built on paper, it answers you in envelopes. And as I stood in my entryway, staring at the seal, my stomach twisted not with fear, but with a strange, tired certainty. The kind that comes when you know a storm is finally breaking and there is no more pretending the sky is clear. The notice summoned me to a hearing regarding a fraudulent signature and unauthorized financial liability. And even though the words were formal and distant, they landed in my chest like names being called at a funeral. And within hours, my phone began buzzing with messages from relatives I had not heard from in years. From Linda's sister, from a man at church, from a neighbor who had once borrowed my ladder, all of them asking if I was really doing this, as if telling the truth were some personal vendetta instead of the only honest response left to me. Linda finally showed up at my door that evening, shoulders hunched against the cold, eyes red, holding a grocery bag like an offering. And when she stepped inside my quiet little ranch house and sat on the edge of my couch, she looked like someone standing in the ruins of a place she thought would always exist, whispering apologies that felt thin, not because they were insincere, but because they were too late. And when she said she had panicked and only meant to help Kyle, I told her calmly that help does not involve putting another man's life in your hands without his consent. And in that calm, I saw the first flicker of real fear cross her face. The fear of realizing she had crossed a line that could not be smoothed over with soft words. The hearing came faster than I expected. And on the morning of it, I walked up the worn courthouse steps with my hips still aching faintly from the shove, wearing a clean jacket and the same boots I had worn to work for years. And inside the courtroom, the air smelled like old paper and floor polish. And Kyle sat stiff in a suit that did not quite fit his swagger. Ray leaned back in his seat with folded arms like this was all an inconvenience. And Linda stared at her hands as if they might tell her what to do if she just watched them long enough. The judge's voice was steady and unmoved by the family drama that filled the benches. And when the credit union presented the signature comparisons and the investigator confirmed that the handwriting did not match mine, the room seemed to shrink, and Kyle's attorney tried to paint it as a misunderstanding. But misunderstandings do not come with forged names and unpaid balances. And when I was asked to speak, I said simply that I had never agreed to co-sign any loan and that my name had been used without my consent. And the judge nodded once, like a door closing. Then came the moment that changed everything. When the judge asked if there was evidence of intent, and I handed over the flash drive with the doorbell camera audio that I had almost forgotten about until Frank reminded me to save everything. And as Kyle's own voice filled the courtroom saying that I would pay it like I always do and calling me just maintenance, the air went completely still. The way it does when truth lands hard and cannot be taken back. And I felt something in my chest finally loosen, not with joy, but with release. Because the lie that had been quietly shaping my place in that family had finally been spoken out loud in a room that mattered. Outside afterward, Linda tried to reach for my sleeve, whispering that she was sorry and that she would sell things and make payments. And I told her gently that this was not about money anymore, that it was about the moment she had chosen to wipe gravy off a floor instead of standing up for her husband. And she cried like a woman realizing she had misjudged the weight of her own choices. And as I walked down those courthouse steps into the cold, I knew that whatever remained of our marriage was now standing on ground that could not be leveled again. The following weeks were a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and quiet shifts in the way people looked at me, some with sympathy, some with judgment, but always with a new awareness that the man they thought was endlessly steady had finally said no. And Kyle's life began to contract in ways he did not expect. His bank account restricted, his truck suddenly for sale, his job prospects dimming as background checks came back complicated. And each time he texted me accusing me of ruining his life, I felt less anger and more clarity. Because the truth is that no one ruins your life faster than you do when you believe someone else will always clean up your mess. And late one night, sitting alone in my living room with my father's chair finally returned to its place by my window, I realized that I was standing at the edge of something far bigger than a family dispute. Something that was going to force me to decide not just what I would forgive, but what I would allow back into my life. And the answer to that question was going to change everything that came after. The quiet that followed the hearing was not peaceful at first. It was the kind of quiet that rings in your ears after something explodes. The kind that makes you notice every creak in the house and every distant siren like they might be warnings meant only for you. And I spent those first few weeks moving through my days slowly, almost carefully, as if the ground beneath my life had shifted and I was still learning where it was safe to place my feet. And in that strange stillness, I began to understand just how much of myself I had given away without realizing it. How many decisions I had softened, how many boundaries I had let blur. How many times I had told myself that love meant endurance, when in reality, it should have meant respect. Linda did not move back in, and our phone calls became fewer and more awkward. Conversations that circled the same hollow apologies and logistical questions about bills and paperwork without ever quite landing on what had truly broken between us. And each time we hung up, I felt both lighter and lonelier, as if part of my chest had finally been unburdened while another part still ached from the shape of what used to be there. Kyle stopped calling almost entirely, but his presence lingered like a bruise you can still feel even after the color fades. And every so often, a mutual acquaintance would mention that he was struggling, that he was angry, that he was blaming me for everything from his frozen account to the way people now looked at him. And while part of me still felt the old instinct to protect him, a quieter but firmer part reminded me that protecting someone from consequences is not the same as loving them. It is sometimes the very thing that keeps them broken. One Saturday afternoon, Frank came over with a six-pack and sat across from me at my kitchen table, glancing at the stack of paperwork that now lived there like a permanent resident. And he told me gently that I needed to think not just about surviving this mess, but about what I wanted my life to look like after it. and his questions stayed with me long after he left, echoing in my head as I sat in my father's chair watching the winter light fade through my window. Because for the first time in years, my future did not feel like a continuation of someone else's expectations. It felt like an open road I had not yet chosen a direction for. Linda came by one evening in early spring, standing in my doorway with a tentative smile that looked as fragile as the tulips just beginning to push through the thawed ground. And she asked if we could talk, and I let her in because shutting her out completely felt like denying a chapter of my own story. But as we sat across from each other and she spoke about counseling and change and wanting to start over, I listened without the desperate hope that had once colored my every reaction to her words. And I realized that while I cared for her, I no longer trusted her with the softest parts of me. And that realization was both heartbreaking and clarifying in a way that made my chest ache. I told her that I needed space, not as punishment, but as protection. That my life could not be built on promises that only held when things were easy. And she cried quietly and nodded. And in that nod, I saw the truth that sometimes love is not enough to rebuild what has collapsed under the weight of betrayal. As spring crept in and the snow retreated into muddy patches along the sidewalks, I began taking long walks again, letting my hips strengthen and my mind wander. And in those walks, I thought about who I had been before I had become so careful, so accommodating, so willing to disappear in small ways to keep the peace. And I started to feel a faint, unfamiliar sense of possibility rising in my chest. A reminder that my life was not over, that my story did not have to end at a Christmas table. And yet beneath that hope was a deep uncertainty. Because letting go of a life you have built is not the same as knowing how to build a new one. And as I stood one evening at my window, watching the sun dip low over the quiet street, I realized that the hardest part was still ahead of me. The part where I would have to choose not just what to leave behind, but what kind of man I was going to become now that my old role had been stripped away. The first truly warm morning of April came in quietly. The kind of morning that sneaks through your windows before you realize winter has finally loosened its grip. And I woke up with sunlight on my face and the faint smell of thawed earth drifting in through a cracked window. And for the first time since Christmas Eve, I did not feel like I was waking up inside a story that had already been written for me. I made coffee and sat in my father's chair, the oak arms cool beneath my palms. And I thought about how strange it was that the object everyone had fought over had never actually been the thing that mattered. Because the real fight had been about who had the right to define my place in the world. And I finally understood that no one else ever had that right unless I handed it to them. The legal dust continued to settle in the background. Restitution plans were formalized. Kyle's name now permanently marked by a lesson he had tried to dodge. And Linda and I moved through our separation with a careful politeness that felt more like a business arrangement than a marriage. And while there were still moments when I missed the life we had planned, I no longer missed the version of myself that had been shrinking inside it. One afternoon, Linda stopped by to return a box of old photographs she had found while cleaning. And as I flipped through them, I saw a younger version of myself smiling too hard. Standing slightly behind her and Kyle in nearly every picture, like I was already stepping out of frame. And that quiet realization felt heavier than any argument we had ever had, because it showed me how long I had been disappearing without calling it loss. Kyle sent me one final message in early May. Not angry this time, just short and guarded, saying that he hoped I was doing okay. And I replied simply that I hoped he would learn to build his life without leaning on other people's names. And that was the last time we spoke. And while that silence carried a trace of sadness, it also carried peace. Because not every relationship is meant to be repaired. And some endings exist to protect the future more than the past. I began volunteering at the local VFW again, fixing chairs, repainting trim. Doing the kind of quiet work that had always steadied my hands and my thoughts. And through that simple rhythm, I felt something inside me settle into a healthier shape. A sense of belonging that did not require me to disappear or be diminished. And as weeks turned into months, I started making small plans for myself again. A fishing trip I had always postponed. A road drive along the river. A possible move someday. All the things I had put on hold while carrying a family that had never truly carried me back. One evening, sitting alone in my living room with the window open and the summer air drifting in, I caught my reflection in the darkened glass and saw a man who looked tired but solid. Older but steadier, and I realized that I had not lost my place at the table after all. I had simply built a new one that did not require me to beg for a chair or defend my name. And in that quiet, deeply earned peace, I finally understood that respect is not something you demand. It is something you choose to require, even when that choice costs you people you once loved. And as the light faded and the house settled around me, I felt something close to gratitude for the man I had been, the lesson I had learned, and the life that was still waiting ahead of me. Because, for the first time in years, I was no longer surviving someone else's story. I was finally living my own.